of Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12 CR 1522. The records reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. Are you ready for the jury, Mr. King?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Brockler?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's bring them in, please. By the way, since we're outside the presence of the jury, juror number 17 indicated that he does have a couple of medical appointments on July 17, so that is a date that we have to take off. So,
Is that your 17 or 155, Your Honor?
17, right? Oh, okay, so 17, it was a she, so, but I think 155 may have, I thought had something that day too, and was indicating that as well. I'll read the note to you. I left it back on my desk, but it looks like we should probably plan on taking that Friday off. So I think in light of that, it probably makes sense to just plan to start any proceedings that we may have to have after the verdict on starting on July 20. If the parties want to think about that and disagree, they can let me know, but I'm not sure what else to plan.
One thing, though, Your Honor, is if we have to have proceedings where we argue or do things outside the presence of the jury, it would make sense to do it beforehand.
Absolutely, and that would be my plan. So, would you get me that note, please, when you get a chance? Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Mr. Brockler, you may proceed with the rest of your cross-examination. And Dr. Woodcock, I remind you that you're still under oath, okay? All right.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think I was up here with the court's permission.
Yes.
Doctor, we've been talking about the importance of considering the defendant's writings leading up to the events here, and I want to approach you with some of the records that you had been provided. I'm handing you, Doctor, what has been marked as, or admitted, I'm sorry, as Exhibit 1081A, 1081B, 347A, 1199, 1200, 1203, 1206, and a big one here, 1227. Now, Doctor, you recognize all those exhibits from having reviewed them before you opined on the defendant's sanity, true?
No, I can't say I recognize 2 inches of records.
Well, and I don't see it in your report that you considered them, but maybe it was like the Hillary Allen texts. Did you review the emails that the defendant sent and received from Hotmail, CU account?
Yes, I've already testified to that.
I'm sorry?
Yes, I've already testified to that. I reviewed several thousand pages of evidence, including emails,
Well,
during 2014.
do you think that you've indicated in your report that you considered all those emails?
No, I've testified to that. You asked me about it. I also testified that I omitted in my report listing the law enforcement records that I had reviewed. But I've testified that I reviewed emails.
And I just want to make sure, for our purposes, that we're accurate about what you omitted from your report. You omitted any reference to considering the Hillary Allen texts. Is that true?
I did not cite those, no.
You didn't cite any of the law enforcement recordings.
That's correct.
You didn't cite the voluminous emails that we've provided.
No.
What else, as you sit here now, and we just had a break, did you go back over your report and consider what else did you omit from that report that you actually considered but didn't put in there?
I would have to go back and look at that material and give you a list.
Did you do that over the break?
No, I don't have that material with me. I've testified that I reviewed several thousand pages of those kinds of materials in 2014.
With those emails in front of you, and you take whatever time you need, can you tell us, based on your review, which email or emails most demonstrate the defendant's disorganized thoughts?
I don't think his emails did demonstrate disorganized thoughts. I don't think his thoughts were terribly disorganized. They were delusional. There's a difference.
Well, point out the email or emails that you think best highlights his delusional thinking.
I don't think that's reflected in emails.
How about not even the CU ones or the Hotmail ones? No? Nothing?
I don't recall any. I don't think he was revealing his delusional ideation except in very careful, limited ways.
Let's talk about who he didn't reveal it to, just to be clear. He didn't reveal it, certainly he didn't reveal it to law enforcement, correct?
Correct.
He didn't reveal it to any of his professors?
No.
He didn't reveal certainly any of the planning these emails indicate he'd been going through to anybody on the planet Earth. You agree with that?
Yes.
And that includes his family, right?
Yes.
In fact, there's an email that's tabbed there in People's Exhibit. Judge, may I approach the witness?
You may.
And I'm asking you this question in the context of him knowing that others would perceive what he was doing as wrong, okay? I've got this tab here. This is from Exhibit 347A. And I want to show you, this is the Hotmails. I don't know if you knew that, but this page here indicates, and you can disagree if I'm not stating it right, this indicates that this email was sent on July 12th, 2012. And I want you to take a look at that. I'm sorry about it's got a big old binder clip on it there. I hope it doesn't spill. I want you to take a look at that. And that was sent about 7 days before the defendant booby traps his apartment and then goes to the theater. You agree with that?
Yes.
So 1 week before, and it's the email where his father or mother, I can't remember which, is telling him, we'd like to come out and see you in August, right?
Yes.
Which date did they say they wanted to come out and see him?
August 10 through 12th.
And say, unless you're busy that weekend, right?
Yes.
Now, let's be clear. Your review of the record shows that by July the 12th of 2012, the defendant had purchased all the guns he was going to purchase for this crime, right?
Yes.
He'd acquired all the ammunition he was going to acquire for this crime, right?
I don't recall that specifically.
Okay. Do you know if he acquired anything after July the 12th?
No, I don't.
Okay. So as far as you know, he had everything prepared for this crime by the time this email exchange occurs between his parents and himself, right?
As far as I know.
And when they say, we'd like to come out and see you August, I think you said 10th to 12th, unless you're busy, tell us what he responded with.
It's not on that page.
It should be at the top.
Oh.
And I'm sorry.
Don't have any plans for that weekend.
Don't have any plans for that weekend. And you'd agree with me that that's true. He didn't have any plans that weekend, right?
I guess, yes, that would be correct.
But also completely misleading in that he knew 1 week from then he would be trying to kill as many people as he could at the Century 16 Theater. You agree with that, right?
No, I don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that at all?
No, I don't think he knew at this time, whether or when it would occur with any certainty.
Hold on. Doctor, forgive me. On July the 12th, you believe that he did not know when he was going to go to that theater and shoot all those people?
That's right. He did not know that.
Doctor, did you review all the purchases from Fandango that he made, and there were 3 of them, to buy tickets for this exact movie in this exact theater where he did this?
Yes, I'm incorporating all of that information about his planning and the purchases that he had made.
By July the 12th, he knew unequivocally that he would be going to theater number 9 at the Century 16 Theater and trying to murder everyone in it, right?
On July 12th, he was psychotic, he was delusional, and his behavior even then was lost in that psychotic state.
And that behavior shows up manifested in these emails.
No, it does not.
Well, it's manifested in his schoolwork.
Well, he certainly his symptoms were manifested in his schoolwork.
In terms of the fact that he was getting A's on the mock grant proposal in April, that kind of thing?
No, at that particular time, he had been out of school for some time. He had dropped out of school.
So the dropping out of the school was, in your opinion, the manifestation of the psychosis?
Absolutely.
But nothing else that he did in school up to that point? Well, where's the evidence, sir, in the spring, in any of his writings, any of his assignments, any of his grades, that he lacked the ability to get an A or a B if that's what he wanted to get?
Well, he didn't get those. He didn't pass his exams, and he had at least variable reviews on his presentations. He also has given the information that he was very, very uncomfortable and increasingly anxious and distressed over the requirements of the coursework, which were interpersonal and required giving these presentations and interacting with the other people in the lab.
Doctor, are you aware of what his GPA was in the spring?
I don't recall it right now.
Do you know where it is in relation to the other 5 students in this neuroscience PhD program?
Well, it's my understanding that he did not pass the exams.
Exams? Which other exams didn't he pass?
To continue on in his program.
You're talking about the one preliminary exam, correct?
Yes.
On June the 7th, correct?
I don't know the exact date, but it was in that time frame.
And
he certainly reflects that he was not performing normally.
Well, you recall also from the discovery that he'd made the decision as early as May the 10th to not study for those prelims in exchange for preparing for this crime, right?
I think that's a mischaracterization of his determination and what he was going through. He's told several examiners that he was increasingly frustrated and symptomatic with the performance demands that were placed upon him in the program during that time. And that that's why he, yes, chose to leave, but he chose to leave because he was increasingly symptomatic and he was increasingly distressed. The conflict that he had with these delusional impulses. that was the struggle that was going on. That's why I can't say on July 12th that he knew exactly what he was doing. He was in the middle of a struggle. He talks about the floodgates opening, and when that happened, he wasn't able to make choices. He was going with the flow. That's the nature of his psychotic disorder.
So can you point to any piece of evidence that shows his complete lack of control at any point up until the time he pulled the trigger 70 plus times in that theater?
That's the dilemma here. He demonstrates a great deal of organized behavior through this time, but that behavior is driven by these delusional impulses, which he's been fighting for at least months. They go back to idiosyncratic ideation, that is, unusual thoughts, to the time of middle school. But by the spring, he's increasingly ill, he's increasingly dysfunctional, he can't continue with the plans and the goals that he had, Plan A, to cure through his work in neuroscience, and he basically, yes, gives up because he can't resist any longer this increasing pathology that he's experiencing.
So this increasing dysfunction, you'd agree, based on what you've reviewed, the only place it shows up is in his decision to pursue killing people instead of continuing to pursue his PhD.
Well, no, it's reflected in a number of other things. It's reflected in his flailing attempts at socialization, which he says were much increased during this time as he's in graduate school and he's making attempts to do what he'd never been able to do before in terms of having a girlfriend and having a successful romantic relationship, and then that doesn't work out, and he goes on the dating websites, and that escalates, and then he gets increasingly anxious about his presentations and gets feedback that his jokes are inappropriate, and then he fails his exams. This is not the course of somebody who is asymptomatic and making rational choices and doing fine.
So this is all stuff he told you?
This is all in the reports that I've reviewed. No, this is not all stuff he told me. This is stuff he told other examiners that he reviewed with Dr. Reed and with Dr. Metzner and with Dr. Gurr principally.
So this is not a conversation you had with him?
No, my opinion is based largely on the very extensive records of those interviews with those examiners, including Dr. Reed.
Well, and when we say the records of the examiners, we mean sans 21 and a half hours of videotaped interview.
That's exactly right. I'm relying in large measure upon Dr. Reed's observations that he felt were important enough to include in his report, and the way Dr. Reed and Dr. Metzner and Dr. Gurr summarized and analyzed the very extensive information that all of us have reviewed, although none of us have reviewed 100,000 pages.
You sure of that?
Yes, I'm sure.
Because you had that conversation with Drs. Reed and Metzner?
That's a guess, that no one has reviewed 100,000 pages.
In fact, we should talk about that. You had the opportunity to call proactively any of the other psychiatrists, and there's at least 2 or 3 forensic psychiatrists in this case, and have conversations with them about their observations beyond what they wrote in their reports, correct?
Yes, I had the opportunity. I relied upon their reports.
And that's your way of saying, I didn't pick up the phone and call a single one of them?
No, I answered that question. No, I didn't call them. I relied on their reports.
Okay. And by the way, the defense never told you don't call these people and have a conversation with them, right?
No, they did not.
In fact, Drs. Reed and Metzner, the court-appointed psychiatrists, they called you to ask you for additional information beyond what was contained in your notes from July 24th, right?
Yes, I had not produced a report.
There's another thing here on this checklist of things, of collateral records to consider in a sanity evaluation, and that is the computer hard drive and communications. We've talked about the emails. Did you go through all of the screenshots and the different searches and stuff that the defendant engaged in on his computer?
I saw some of them, yes.
Well, why not all of them?
I don't know how many of them I saw. I know I reviewed those. For instance, this email that you just showed me, I recall now having seen that. That was included in what I saw.
Which screenshots do you think were significant to your evaluation?
I don't recall. I considered everything I looked at.
Well, I know, but did any of them stick out in your mind as being even relevant?
I don't recall specifically now.
And there's nothing listed in your report, of course, about that, right?
No, I didn't list that in my report.
Now look, this list, and there's a couple others I want to go through with you. Are you familiar with that list of things that you should review as collateral records to consider in a sanity evaluation? Have you seen that somewhere before?
Yes.
Where?
Textbook on forensic psychiatry.
In fact, it's a chapter called The Insanity Defense, correct?
I believe so.
And it's a chapter that you not only rely upon to help you in doing what you did here, it's one that you cited in your report, correct?
Yes, I reviewed it before I wrote my report.
And to be clear, you did not do all the things on that checklist?
I did what the checklist requires, which is to consider all the evidence. There's no way I was able, had the time to review all the evidence, so I had to decide what the most relevant evidence was and whether, based upon the evidence that I thought was most relevant, which I have, with the exceptions I've noted, cited in my report, whether that allowed me the sufficient background to reach the conclusions I did. These lists are what is often available and can be considered, but I had to decide, first of all, what was the most important material, and then whether or not I could reach the conclusions and publish a report based upon that relevant information, and that's what I did. I certainly considered all of these categories. I've reviewed a great deal of information in virtually all of them, and I've reviewed reviews of this information from 3 other forensic psychiatrists.
Forensic psychiatrists?
Yes.
You keep saying, not just in the cross here, but in some of your answers on direct, that you didn't have time. Fair?
That's right.
Now, my recollection is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you were asked to undergo a review and a potential opinion and impressions as early as June of 2014, right?
Yes.
You issued your report on March 26, 2015, while we were in jury selection, correct?
Yes.
And that would be, by my bad math, about 9 months, correct?
That may be correct.
June to March.
Okay, June to March is 9 months.
Now, when you were asked to do this by Mr. King, did you tell him, listen, there's so much stuff, I don't think I can appropriately review everything and give you an opinion?
I had that discussion. I didn't use the word appropriately because that was subsumed. We certainly had a discussion about what I could review and what I wouldn't have time to review. And I made it clear that I wouldn't be able to review everything. I also made it clear that it was his call based on what I could and couldn't review as to whether or not I would do a report, but that I would independently decide based on what I did have time to review whether I could reach conclusions regarding whether Mr. Holmes was mentally ill, what kind of mental illness he had, and a relationship between the mental illness and sanity. And I reached the conclusion, based upon the evidence that I did review, that I could reach that conclusion, and I very sincerely, professionally believe that the information that I reviewed supports those opinions very, very strongly. If there's other information that could possibly change those opinions, I'd be happy to review it, but I reviewed thousands of pages of documents, the other opinions of the other doctors, the information that they summarized, and I believe that that review very, very strongly supports my opinions, and I wouldn't present those opinions if I didn't believe so.
Thank you. Now, there's another list on here in this chapter that you've cited and relied upon that talks about sample questions to help evaluate mental state at the time of the offense. Are you familiar with those questions to be asked?
Yes.
Now, I understand that you'd already opined on his sanity 5 days before you saw him, but you saw him nonetheless. And I want to go through these. Unless you know them by heart, I can give you a copy of the list and we can go through and see if you asked him.
I'd certainly appreciate a copy of the list.
May I approach the witness, Your
You
Honor?
may.
Sir, this is the entire chapter, and you can ignore some things that are underlined there, but take a look at page 363 up there.
Judge, I think for the record, we need to indicate what the doctor is looking at.
Mr. Brockler.
Yeah, Doctor, to be clear, this is chapter, well, it doesn't have a number, the Insanity Defense chapter out of the textbook of Forensic Psychiatry, 2nd edition, correct?
I believe so. I don't have that information in front of me, but I believe that's correct.
Well, having cited it in your report, you've seen it before, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
I
so
have.
does it look familiar to you?
Is it my copy? Because it looks like it's underlined the same way I underlined it.
I don't know. Is it?
I'd have to look at my copy, which I don't have with me. Looked like a copy of the same chapter.
Are you ready?
Yes.
One of the things that it suggests that you ask is, did you prepare for this? If so, how? Do you see that? On page 363, sir? That sample questions?
Yes.
You never asked the defendant that.
I did not ask him that, no. That had been reviewed extensively in the other reports.
So the answer to my question is no, I never asked the defendant that.
Yes, that's what I told
Okay.
you.
What did you do immediately following this offense? You didn't ask him that.
No, I did not ask him that. Again, that had been covered in the materials that I reviewed.
At the time you committed this crime, did you know it was against the law?
No, I didn't ask him that.
Would you have done this if a police officer was near or at the scene? If yes, why? If no, why not?
No, again, I knew the answer to that question based on the review that I had done.
Would you have done this if someone unexpected arrived at the scene? If yes, why? If no, why not? You didn't ask that?
I didn't ask that question. Again, I knew the answer to that question based on the materials I'd reviewed and the knowledge of his behavior during the crime.
Sure, and we'll talk about what you knew from the other reports, okay, in just a moment. Is there anything that made you think what you did was a right thing to do? If so, what? You never asked him that.
Not that specific question.
Well, give us the general question you asked then.
I asked him a number of related questions that are on page 3 of my report. I asked him his general thoughts about what had happened, what he had done. I asked him about his current understanding about why he did it. I asked him if he felt he could go back in his mind to review what was going on then.
Doctor, you think that's the same as saying, tell me why you think what you did was right?
It's not exactly the same thing, no.
Okay. There's another checklist to go through here if you go to 365, Doctor. Now this gets us to the place where you are now going to begin to consider capacity, right? Capacity to know right from wrong. Fair?
Yes.
And the only law that is relevant to that analysis is Colorado law, right?
Yes.
Not the model penal code, correct?
Correct.
But you cite the model penal code in your opinion, correct?
I do.
That's not what governs us, though. It's Colorado. Fair?
That's correct.
And you have thoroughly reviewed the Colorado statutes that you tried to apply to this situation, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, in discovering the evidence that may indicate a defendant's knowledge of legal wrongfulness at the top of page 365, I want to talk to you about that list. Number one thing is efforts to avoid detection. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me that the defendant's efforts to avoid detection in this case are pretty extensive.
Before the event, but interestingly not after the event.
We'll get there. But remember, efforts to avoid detection before he commits the crime. Lots of evidence of that, right?
And also evidence that he did not avoid detection after the crime.
We'll get there. Did you understand my question about
I'm addressing this particular issue.
Okay. You never asked him about his efforts to avoid detection.
Well, this refers not to questions, but to evidence. I had a great deal of evidence regarding that.
But you chose not to follow up with him on that, correct?
I didn't ask him about that specifically.
You didn't even ask him about the part you want to talk about, which is your claim that he didn't try to avoid detection after the crime. Fair?
I think that's true. I believe it's true. I didn't ask him about that. That had been covered by the other examiners in my reviews.
I understand. With, by the way, different answers. You'd agree with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so one of the things we could do if we gave one answer to Dr. Reed, one answer to Dr. Metzner, and one answer to Dr. Gurr is you could come in as the guy that's doing this in the early part of 2015 while we're in jury selection, is you can go and ask him and set the record straight, correct? Get him to tell you which version is true.
Not at all. That's the whole problem with reconstructing someone's psychotic mind 4 days later or 2 years later and under different examination circumstances and with different questions and the different contexts of those questions. What we all have to try to understand is what his state of mind was at the time that this was happening. And he's not going to be, interestingly, the most reliable guide to that because he was very delusionally psychotic at that time. And he's had time since then to try to reconstruct in his own mind what was going on then. So even his information has to be taken really with a lot of interpretation and understanding of what the context was and what we know what's going on at that time. So it's not surprising me at all that he would give different information at different times. And if I had asked him the same questions, I would have gotten a somewhat different answer also. The issue of suggestion is very important in this. How is the question asked? Is the question asked in a suggestive way? I know that some of the things that I asked regarding, for instance, the hair, the answer that I got was, I don't know. But when Dr. Reed suggested possibilities, then he got different answers. So interestingly, Mr. Holmes, after the event, is not necessarily a clear guide as to what his state of mind was. That's why we go through this process. Particularly in the event that someone may be in the midst of a psychotic, delusional state.
So, just to be clear then, it wouldn't have mattered, frankly, if Dr. Metzner or Dr. Reed had ever asked the defendant any of these questions?
I don't know. I know that I didn't feel that I needed to go down either of these lists. I certainly considered them. I read them. I went through this chapter pretty quickly before I saw him and determined what I was going to ask him in light of this information. There's a great deal of information. I asked him probably several hundred questions. But the relevance of each one of these questions in view of the information that I had already received and reviewed and considered is quite variable. I asked him questions that I thought were central to my understanding, first of all, of his mental state at the time that I was seeing him, because that's what I wanted to understand. I also asked him a lot of questions about what was going on during this event and prior to this event. And if I had thought that there were other relevant questions, particularly these that are on the list, I would have asked them.
And that was the answer to the question, so it wouldn't have mattered if Dr. Reed or Dr. Metzner had asked him any of these questions.
That was my answer, yes.
Okay. Something else that it asks you to check on or to consider on this list is whether or not the guy was wearing gloves during the crime. Right?
Yes.
And he was. Right?
Yes, that was in evidence. He was wearing a lot of things.
Waiting to commit the crime until the cover of darkness is something else to consider, right?
Yes.
And he did that, didn't he?
Yes.
Both dark inside and outside the theater, right?
Yes.
Something about whether or not he is wearing a mask or a disguise. And he was wearing a mask, right?
Yes.
In fact, you know from reviewing the pictures here that he didn't just put on a gas mask. He altered the gas mask to cut down on the visibility through the plastic pieces around his face, correct?
Yes.
And concealing a weapon on the way to the crime. You'd agree with that, right?
It's on the list.
Oh, yeah, but you'd agree he did that.
Yes.
You asked him about none of those things, correct?
Virtually all of those things I had direct information about, virtually everything on the list. The other problem is that although this is a suggested list from Dr. Resnick,
Who?
Dr. Resnick, it's cited here, source.
Dr. Resnick.
He's a forensic psychiatrist.
Do you know him?
I've been in his courses.
Pretty reputable guy?
Yes.
Expert in his field?
Yes.
Forensic psychiatrist?
Forensic psychiatrist.
You'd rely on his opinions?
No.
Okay, go on then.
Very good. Thank you.
Go on.
The problem here is that this is a list from Dr. Resnick that says these are things that should be considered. The problem is that there's no research that shows that anything on this list correlates with whether or not somebody was mentally ill or whether they were trying to manipulate or avoid detection or whether they were sane. There's no research that anything on this list correlates with those things. It's a list that says pay attention to these things because sometimes they'll tell you what was going on in the mind of this person. But there's no research saying that they correlate with either mental illness or sanity. And this is a very good example of that. In spite of the fact that many of the things on this list of evidence are positive, there's no evidence at all that they dissuade anybody from thinking that Mr. Holmes had a severe mental illness and that it impacted his behavior, as has been opined, as I understand, by both of the prosecution experts.
And that was the answer to the question you never asked him about these?
No, you asked me if I thought Dr. Resnick was, I don't remember exactly what the question was, but it wasn't the one you just cited.
About relying on his opinion?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm explaining why I disagree that this tells us anything about either mental illness or sanity.
Well, and you've got the background, don't you?
Thank you.
Let's take a look at further down that list. It's different from efforts to avoid detection. There's actually fleeing from the scene. So that's separated out on this list, correct?
Yes.
There's also efforts to avoid apprehension, correct?
Yes.
One of the things that you go into in your report is that you say his behavior following the killings was both unusual following such a crime. And you say that because he just gave up, right?
He didn't leave the scene. He gave up when he was approached.
What did he tell you about why he gave up?
I didn't ask him about that. Again, it was material that was included in the
Sure.
records I reviewed.
What did he tell Dr. Metzner was the reason he gave up?
I don't recall specifically right now.
What was the reason he told Dr. Reed he gave up?
I don't recall specifically. I know I reviewed those reports, and they were consistent with the conclusions I reached. There was nothing about what he told the other doctors which was inconsistent with my opinions regarding his illness, the relationship between his illness and his behavior or his sanity.
I understand. But what you've said here, which is important enough for you to include in a pretty good-sized paragraph on page 12 at the bottom, is this idea that he would not flee. And that was really weird to you, right?
I didn't think it was weird at all. I thought it was entirely consistent with the formulation that I had reached regarding his mental illness, the nature of his delusional state, what his delusional state was protecting us from in its psychotic formulation. That it wasn't weird. It fit precisely this formulation of his illness.
Let's go through the evidence of what he did to put himself in a position to escape, okay? Tell me everything you know from the record that indicated he was setting himself up to be able to leave that theater.
Well, the evidence is that he walked out of the theater and stood by and didn't leave the scene. That's what I'm referring to as being unusual for this kind of a crime, but consistent with the psychopathology that I think everyone has described.
And doctor, what he said was, I stepped outside, I saw the police, I did an assessment, I saw that I was outnumbered and I was unlikely to get away. It would be hard to drive in ballistic pants, so I gave up. Do you recall that?
As one of his explanations, yes.
As one of his explanations, right. He had road stars in his car. Do you remember that?
Yes.
What are they?
They would stop a vehicle from following him.
And didn't he say that's why he got them, correct?
Yes.
He had money in his pocket, yes or no?
I don't recall.
Money that he could use if he drove away? Do you recall?
I don't recall.
How about statements that he made about maybe wanting to flee to the airport? Did he ever make that statement?
I don't recall.
Is it fair then that to come to the conclusion that you've come to about his, what you believe is an irrational decision to not try to flee as the police arrived, that you had to pick a statement that you agreed with and disregard the others?
No, I'm referring to his behavior specifically. He didn't try to get away. And at least on one occasion, he did say, I guess this is cherry picking, but he did say that he didn't need to get away because his mission had been accomplished. That's certainly consistent with his delusional state. If there were police there when he left and he decided not to try to escape from them, certainly that would have been a piece of information that he had to deal with at the time. But the fact that he didn't at that time try to escape, I think is consistent with his delusional belief that doing this would accomplish his increase in worth and ability to deal with his anxiety about suicidal ideation.
So that I'm clear, if he tried to escape, he's sane. If he doesn't try to escape, he's insane. Is that right?
I think that none of these things, just like the things on Dr. Resnick's list, go 100% one way or the other. They're not proof of it. They're information that we have to consider as part of our overall analysis, and whether or not that particular behavior would be consistent. Certainly his statement that he thought he would get injured if he tried to escape from the police is a rational statement. That would be consistent with organization. It doesn't tell us about whether or not he was sane. He was able to process that information. His statement that he didn't need to escape because his mission had been accomplished is consistent with his delusions, and apparently he's made both statements.
Anything else you want to add about that?
Well, that his behavior, I think, in not trying to escape and standing standing by while the police hadn't even recognized that he wasn't a policeman, is consistent with his delusional disorganization or delusional system.
Or consistent with someone who made a rational assessment of the scene and figured the path that would take them to not being hurt the most would be to stand there and leave your gun on your car.
Yes, I've just given that as one of the alternatives.
One of the other things that you put in your report is that you think that the defendant was thinking that murdering these people was something that was a benefit to them, right?
Yes.
And he told you that.
I don't believe he told me that. I think it was in the other reports.
He told who that?
I'm sorry?
Who did he tell that to?
I know I came across it in the reports. I don't recall which of the examiners he told it to.
Let's do it piecemeal. He did not tell you that, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, going back to July 24, 2012, he told you that that option was bad for people and he wouldn't want it to happen to him, correct?
Well, he said several different things. That was one of the things he said.
So he said that he wouldn't want it to happen to him, correct?
Yes.
And you don't know where you got the idea that he thought killing these people would be something that would be good for them.
I think it was in Dr. Gurr's report.
And Dr. Gurr is the other defense-hired psychiatrist, correct?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me that nowhere in the record does he make that statement to any other person, you included.
That may be true.
No, not maybe. Is it true or is it not? If you don't know, tell us, I don't know the record.
I don't know the answer to that question, if it's in anybody else's interviews or not.
Do you recall seeing it anywhere other than the other defense psychiatrist report?
I see it in my review of Dr. Gurr's interview.
Now, when you read that and you see that it does not match what he said to Dr. Metzner and Dr. Reed, you want to look into that by looking at collateral evidence, don't you?
I don't believe I came across any evidence that it didn't match, that there were discrepancies in the overall description of his psychosis and delusions among these different reports.
Do you believe that he made statements to Drs. Reed and Metzner that were consistent with him believing that killing these people in the theater was something that would be of benefit to them and they would welcome it?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay. But there is evidence in the record that would suggest he didn't think that it would be good for them and he didn't think they would welcome it, correct?
Yes, he states contradictory things about its impact on other people.
Well, we don't have to go to his statements. Let's go to some physical evidence and stuff like that, okay? And we can also go, to the notebook, which he wrote too. He purchased handcuffs, true or false?
I believe so, yes.
How many pair?
I don't recall.
What did he purchase them for?
I don't recall.
He purchased the handcuffs, he said, in the notebook so that he could lock the doors to the theater to keep the people he was doing a favor for from fleeing. Do you agree?
Yes.
In fact, when he's doing his assessment of each of the theaters at Century 16, he puts in there specific references to whether it was too easy to escape from the theaters. Do you agree?
Yes.
He wants to minimize the ability for the people he's going to try to kill from escaping. Correct?
That would be evidence for that, yes.
Yeah. He shot at people that were trying to flee from the favor he was doing for them. Correct?
Yes, none of it makes sense.
I understand. Thank you for that. But the answer to the question is he shot at them, right?
Yes, we know he shot at.
He bought body armor and a lot of it, didn't he?
Yes.
Why did he buy it?
Presumably to protect himself.
Not presumably. What did he say he bought it for?
I I don't recall that specifically, or in which report.
Do you recall him telling anyone that, in part, the body armor was so that he would look imposing and ominous to keep people from rushing him in the theater?
Yes.
You recall that?
Yes.
He can't have people rushing him. In fact, I think he said he can't have 400 people rushing him. Do you recall that?
I recall that, that reason, yes.
Did he buy tear gas?
Yes.
How much?
I don't know.
Why did he buy it?
Probably for the same reason.
Not probably. What does he tell us he bought it for?
I don't recall specifically.
He told us he bought it for crowd control, right?
That may be.
You don't remember.
I don't remember. It's all
Okay.
really irrational.
Thank you for
And-
continuing
and-
to throw those
and
words in at
that-
the end of your answers.
Judge,
This-
counsel needs to let the witness answer the question.
The objection's overruled.
Now, Doctor, you know that he went to the movie theater by his own account, what was it, like 8 or 9 times between June and July to plan for this murder that he didn't know he was actually going to do on July 20th. You agree with that?
Yes.
And the part of doing that was to scout out these places, not just for escape routes, but to get a sense of the layout of the individual theaters. True?
Yes, that's consistent with his ability during this time to have very organized, directed behavior in spite of his psychosis.
Thank you for adding that last part in. The other thing that he would have taken into consideration is how these people would react when he started shooting at them, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that looks pretty obvious to you and to me and to anyone is that people would duck behind those seats, right?
Yes.
And one of the other things that he did then was to make the decision to buy different kinds of bullets for his assault rifle. You agree with that?
Yes.
What kind of bullets did he buy?
I don't recall.
Have you ever heard the term steel penetrator rounds?
Yes.
Where did you hear that before?
Well, I've heard it in the general media, but I do recall that that was part of his ammunition.
And those steel penetrator rounds would allow him to go through steel, right?
Yeah, yes,
And movie seats,
yes,
correct?
presumably.
He believed that he run the risk that people would want to shoot him for what he was going to do, correct?
Yes.
And you are aware that of all the records that exist in this case that you've had access to, not one time does the defendant ever lament that he wasn't able to help more people die, correct?
I believe that's true.
In fact, the only thing he concerns himself with is that he was only able to kill 12, and his value would have been more had he killed more, correct?
Yes, that was his delusion.
Thank you for adding that.
That was his delusion.
He makes reference to hate in his chats with Miss Dada, correct?
Yes.
He makes reference to hate in his notebook, correct?
Yes.
How many times? Do you know?
No,
More than once.
I believe so.
He makes reference to hate throughout the statements that he gives about this case, correct?
Yes.
What did he tell you about hatred?
Nothing.
You didn't ask him.
I didn't ask him about hatred. It was covered in Dr. Reed's interview and report, I recall. It had to do with his intense anxiety about being around people.
And that's the answer to the question, you didn't ask him about hate.
Yes, that's right.
One of the things that you say here in your consideration of his capacity is you reference a couple different things. One, you reference the phrase rescue delusion. Do you recall that?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you this previously mentioned and discussed DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5. It may be in there, doctor, but I couldn't find it. Is that term rescue delusion in there?
No, I don't believe so. It's a descriptive term in this case. It's not a term of art.
Did you invent it?
I don't think so. I think it was in Dr. Gurr's report. But if I did invent it, it was meant to be descriptive. One might refer to all kinds of delusions by their content or their intent. That doesn't mean they become terms of art and make their way into DSM. They're a description of what's relevant in that particular circumstance.
You wouldn't be surprised if rescue delusion, there's simply no research that anyone can find in psychiatry about the term rescue delusion. You would agree with that?
That's why I said it's not a term of art. It's a description in this case of his desire basically to rescue himself.
You also use the phrase command delusion. Do you remember that?
Yes.
You use that multiple times, right?
Yes.
Take a look at that DSM-5. Find us the command delusion in there.
Command, again, this is a term that was referred to also by Dr. Gurr. Command is usually used as an adjective in regard to hallucinations rather than delusions. He had compelling or compulsive delusions, and both Dr. Gurr and I have referred to them as command delusions because they were associated with this sense that he had of the floodgates being opened and an inability to resist.
And you, in fact, so you've then parroted Dr. Gurr's words into your report.
I guess you could use that verb.
Well, use a different one.
I used the same term.
Okay. Real quick here, a follow-up on this, the videos you didn't watch. If you were concerned with suggestive questions being asked of the defendant in terms of the answers he gave, why didn't you watch the entire video of Dr. Reed or read the entire transcript to see if he was making suggestive questions?
The reason that I did not, first of all, is that I didn't have time during this time frame to do it. What I had to ask myself in that regard was, if I didn't watch that, would I be able to reach the conclusions that I did? Did I have reason to believe that there was information in that video and in that transcript that I thought would change my mind? It's not just that information. There's a lot of information that I did not review. I did review enough information, again, to reach the conclusions that I did, and I think my conclusions are well supported by the information that I have cited and that's cited by the other examiners.
One of the other things that you reference here are impulses and compulsions. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And in fact, in your report here, you reference something called irresistible impulse. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you factor that into your analysis of whether he has the capacity to know right from wrong?
No.
Whether he has the capacity to form the intent and after deliberation, right?
No.
Well, you're aware that that phrase, irresistible impulse, it's not in the Colorado law. You're aware of that?
That's right. That's why I didn't factor it in.
But you wrote it in your report.
Yes.
Why?
Because I think it's relevant to its clinical situation, but not to the determination of insanity.
Were you asked to generate a report on your clinical impression, or were you opining on his sanity?
Both. As I've already stated, I don't think it's possible to opine on his sanity if one doesn't have a good understanding of his psychopathology. I don't know how one could do that.
So all this talk about impulse, compulsion, all that stuff, you don't believe that's part of the sanity determination?
No, it's not part of the sanity determination. It's part of the clinical assessment.
Okay. There's a statement that you make on page, 12 or something. Here it is, page 7. Under appreciation of the wrongfulness of the incident behavior. You'd agree with this. At a purely cognitive level, Mr. Holmes did appreciate that what he was planning was against the law and would be considered wrong by others, correct?
Yes.
Now, what's important to note about that, and I wanted to ask you about some of the hypotheticals you provided, Mr. King, was societal standards of morality under the law in Colorado are not subjective, are they?
No, they're not.
They're objective, correct?
Correct.
So it's not what he thinks is moral or what he thinks is right is wrong, correct?
That's right.
It's whether or not he recognizes that society or others would view it as wrong, correct?
That's exactly right.
And you concluded that he knew others would think it was wrong, right?
That's different than knowing that it was wrong by societal standards. His delusions prevented him from understanding that.
And the proof of that is what he told you.
I think that the evidence for that is the information about his psychosis, the nature of his psychosis, and the nature of his delusions. The delusions basically obviated whatever recognition that he had that other people would think that it was wrong. The delusions were telling him that it was right, and that if these people understood, they would think that it was right also. So from a societal standpoint, he did not have an understanding that it was wrong. That was the intensity and the extent of his delusional belief.
So when you
Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to, if I was only using the personal criteria, the personal perspective criteria, I couldn't have reached the conclusion that he was insane under Colorado law.
Understood. Doctor, when you use the phrase, he appreciated what he was planning was against the law and would be considered wrong by others, when you say wrong by others, are you talking about people not society?
No, it has to do with the difference between the residual cognitive awareness he had and the nature of the delusions, which were his operating principle at the time. He wouldn't have done the planning he did if he didn't have some cognitive awareness, but the cognitive awareness did not obviate or override these delusional beliefs that he had, which were the operative basis of his behavior.
Can we talk about some of the things that we would agree upon, and that is the defendant knew what he was going to do was going to kill other people, correct?
Yes.
And he knew that they would not want to be killed, correct?
No, he did not.
He did not. And that's based on what Dr. Gurr wrote in her report.
In part, yes.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, he believed that they would not be harmed, that they would not mind being killed. That's what his delusion told him.
He knew that what he was planning would take their lives, correct?
Yes.
And he believed that they would resist those attempts to take their lives, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, he planned to prevent them from resisting his efforts to take their lives, correct?
Yes.
And he knew that it would be murder.
He knew it would be killing. His delusions told him he was doing these people a favor.
Yeah, you keep saying telling him, and yet there's not a single voice hallucination that occurs any time prior to this. Is that fair?
That's right. That's the difference between a delusion and a hallucination.
Yeah. And by the way, the delusion is the fixed false belief, right?
Yes, and by fixed we mean that it can't be changed by reason. It doesn't mean it stays the same over time. It means that at any one particular time there's no evidence that can change it. Delusions do change over time. So that's an important distinction in terms of the word fixed.
This fixed false belief was expressed to one of the treaters, the forensic psychiatrist, that he thought there was a 50-50 chance it would help him feel better, correct?
Yes.
That's not a belief as much as a hope, is it?
That's also a statement 2 years after what was going on. So we're trying to reconstruct what was going on the night that this occurred. That's a reconstruction in his mind under an examination 2 years later.
So if the statements don't match the conclusion, we just disregard them.
We consider them all, but we have to ask ultimately what was going on at that time and what is the evidence that we have for understanding it. What is the explanation here that is consistent with most of the data? That a lot of the data, particularly regarding his statements about these things, is inconsistent, as I would expect it to be.
Doctor, one of the other things that you remember is that the defendant, right afterwards, expressed concern over having done a favor for killing a child. Do you recall that?
Yes.
That's inconsistent, isn't it, with someone who thinks he's doing that child a favor?
Well, yes, it is inconsistent. The question is, at what level did he feel that, or was it really was it at some level consistent with his delusional state? And I got the sense in reviewing that information that he regretted that. He hadn't wanted to kill children, but if that was another price to be paid, that it would still increase his worth.
And that regret you've described would be an expression of his knowing that it was wrong or believing it was wrong to kill a child.
It's something, it's part of the irrational, inconsistent part of this. He did not see it as so wrong, the possibility as so wrong, as to avoid doing what he did and take that possibility. And I think that's consistent with the overriding delusional belief that even if I kill a child, it's worth it to increase my worth.
This thing that he does in the theater there, it was not a hastily planned thing, correct?
No, it had long planning.
And I asked you about if he wanted to. Let me ask you, his objective was to kill as many people as possible in that theater, correct?
Yes.
Hey, tell me about the nuns. Remember you brought up the hypothetical about the nuns as the conscientious objectors. Are they delusional?
No.
Are they insane?
No.
Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Yeah, Doctor, here's one. You're in your report here, you reference that chapter that we went through, and you talk about the chapter saying that there are 2 steps. Let me find it for you. Bottom of page 8, impression. There are 2 principal steps in assessing a patient for insanity, and then you cite that chapter. Fair?
Yes.
The chapter actually says there's 3 steps, correct?
I don't recall that. I guess I'll have to check that. Is that chapter here? Can you cite that point in the chapter, please?
I'm sorry, Doctor, I was distracted there for a minute. What did you ask me, sir?
Can you cite where it is in the chapter? That might save us some time.
Yep. So it's on page 362 at the bottom where it says the sanity opinion. And the first sentence is, there are 3 important areas to review when rendering an opinion on a defendant's criminal responsibility. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And you just went through 2 of them, correct?
No, I did all 3. The third one is, the examiner must apply the relevant insanity test when evaluating the relationship between the person's mental disorder and his or her alleged acts. So I didn't list it here. But I certainly did it in my report.
Thank you. One other thing I wanted to cover with you. You write down in your report as evidence of his cognitive deterioration, his apartment. You recall that?
Can you cite that in my
Yep.
report?
Bottom of page 11. His planning and construction of the bomb devices and chemicals in his apartment was not successful.
Yes.
And that to you was evidence of his cognitive decline. Fair?
Yes.
Had it been successful, you would not have viewed it as a sign of his cognitive decline.
No.
So had someone opened the door and tripped the wire, spilling the glycerin into the potassium permanganate, creating a flash fire that would have set everything else off, that would have been a reflection of no cognitive decline.
Objection calls for speculation. There's no proof that that could have happened.
Overruled.
As I reviewed the information
Yep.
about what he had set up,
Yep.
there was evidence that in terms of the devices, the triggering for the bombs and the chemicals, that he had not constructed those things in such a way that they would be successful, particularly in regard to the chemicals, but I think also in terms of the electronics. Given his science background, I think he should have been able to construct those things successfully. So in my report, I think that I cited that as evidence that either he wasn't motivated to do that, he hadn't really tried, or he didn't have the cognitive capacity to do that. I think that those are the explanations. I didn't come across any evidence that something was done successfully. Maybe that's correct, but I haven't seen any evidence that anything was really done successfully, and there is evidence that at least in those 2 areas things were not done successfully.
And that's the measure for you of cognitive decline.
Well, I've mentioned the other things earlier in my testimony that I think represented his cognitive and functional difficulties during this time, but I did cite that as one evidence.
And what part of his background, which class would he have taken that would have taught him to make explosives in his apartment?
Well, I've taken many of the similar science classes.
Not you, sir.
Chemistry.
Him.
Chemistry, for instance.
Chemistry?
That's the main one, yes. He took chemistry classes.
And that's all he would have needed to know to set up these bombs?
And the internet, yes.
So he goes to the internet and teaches himself how to make these bombs, correct?
That was my understanding.
In fact, he says, I didn't get this from just some manual. This was me coming up with my way to do it, correct?
That would be evidence of disorganized thinking.
Did you understand my question?
Can you repeat your question?
We'll just keep moving on. Doctor, he did not use fake gasoline, correct?
That's my understanding.
He didn't use fake gunpowder, right?
No, if he'd used those things, I would have concluded that he wasn't meaning to do this at all. I reached the conclusion that this reflected disorganization because he did use, obviously, ingredients that might have done this, but they were put together wrong.
Put together wrong in whose opinion?
Well, in the opinion I guess in the opinion of the people who had looked at these things and determined that they were not going to be effective.
Would those people be people, we'll call them from the FBI?
I believe so. I believe that that was the conclusion that was reached based upon the records that I reviewed.
If you are in error, big hypothetical, you're in error, and let's say the FBI and other bomb people come in and had testified in front of these folks that had that tripwire or any other mechanism started a fire in that apartment, it would have consumed the apartment and probably the building.
Well, that's not what I'm basing my opinion on. I'm basing my opinion upon the fact that he did construct certain things and put together certain chemicals, and he did it in such a way that they were ineffective. It doesn't mean that he didn't do anything that was effective, but that he did things that were ineffective or put together improperly and either represented a lack of motivation to do it right or the ability to do it right.
Just so that I know what you're saying, because it didn't get triggered, that's the sign of cognitive deficit. Correct? Because it didn't work. Right?
Because there were things that were put together so that they wouldn't work.
Hold on. That's different.
That was my understanding of the evidence.
Yeah, but again, you don't disagree with FBI witnesses that would have come in here and said it would have worked. You wouldn't disagree with them?
Well, I don't know exactly what that means because it didn't work. Things didn't go off.
I understand. Thank you.
There was no distraction created.
I understand.
He didn't accomplish that.
Nobody tripped that wire, did they?
Or the bombs didn't go off.
Somebody did trip the wire and the bombs didn't go off.
Well, it was my understanding that the bombs and the chemicals were constructed in such a way that they didn't need to have the tripwire. That they were supposed to independently go off.
Just by themselves?
Yeah,
That's your understanding of the evidence.
that was my understanding.
And
of
it's
the
that
evidence.
understanding of the evidence that informs your determination that because it didn't work, he had a cognitive deficit
Or a lack of motivation.
or lack of motivation. Okay. Well, thank you for clearing that up. May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
Sorry, Doctor, there's one piece of paper I have to find. Doctor, real quickly, you would agree, I know you think that the defendant couldn't deliberate. That's what you've testified to, right? He lacked the ability to deliberate on his conduct, correct?
That's correct.
But you would agree that he could act with an awareness that his conduct was of such a nature that he would end up killing people or potentially blowing up his apartment. He had that awareness, right?
That was the core of his delusion.
So the
to
answer
kill
is
people.
no. He wasn't aware that he was going to kill people or could blow up his apartment.
That was the nature of his delusion. His awareness was incorporated into the delusion. That's the point about the psychosis. He didn't have an independent awareness in terms of his behavior. His behavior was, in my opinion, determined by that delusional system. So yes, he had the awareness that his delusion was telling him to kill people.
Judge, I can't think of any more questions. Thank you.
Okay, is there any redirect, Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, would counsel approach for just a moment, please? Members of the jury, would you rather go to lunch now or wait 20 to 30 minutes? Let's have everybody raise your hand. Those of you who want to go to lunch now, raise your hand. 3, 4, It's less than the majority. All right, are you all okay hanging on for another 20 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes? Yes, and people are saying yes. Okay, we'll proceed then. Mr. King, you may proceed with your redirect examination.
March through this if as quickly as I can, Doctor, so you don't have to pitch tent here again. Now, Mr. Brockler started out talking to you a great deal about your curriculum vitae and the things that you wrote in your curriculum vitae. And there was a lot of talk about a hyphen and what that meant. When you write your curriculum vitae, are you attempting to mislead anyone about your credentials by placing hyphens in certain locations, sir?
No, everything in my CV can be checked and probably is.
You were asked about the transcription of your notes, and Mr. Brockler asked if it was at sometime later, did the defense lawyers contact you and request that you translate the notes because they were illegible? Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Do you recall, in fact, why you did translate the notes, or whether it was at our request or not?
It was at Dr. Reed's request. When he talked to me on the phone, I think he asked me if I had any notes because he knew that I didn't have a report. And he asked me if I could send or and I knew that they would need to be transcribed. So I told him I would ask Mr. King as to whether or not he would allow that, and he said yes, and so that was why and when I did it.
So was there ever, and that was in 2014 that that conversation took place with Mr. Reed?
Yes.
And so at any point prior to that, did myself or the prosecution or the court or anybody contact you and say, these notes are illegible, we can't read them?
No, I was not asked to produce any report or my notes.
In fact, I appear to be able to read your notes perfectly fine.
I'm sorry?
Did I have discussions with you about your notes?
No.
Now, the transcription that you made, are you saying that this is a court reporter accurate transcription of your notes, or were there some words in there, like I think rapport and support was brought up, that maybe you could have gotten wrong in the translation?
Yes, there were a number of words like that, and I did my best to, I did indicate when I wasn't sure in the transcription that that was the case. I'd never anticipated transcribing the notes or making them available.
And does that mean that the content of the notes is somehow suspect, or the statements that Mr. Holmes made to you are somehow suspect, or that they're not reliable to base your opinions on?
Overruled?
No, the notes were taken for my benefit during the interview, as I think I've indicated already is my custom when I interview people.
Now, you were asked a lot of questions about videotaping, okay? Did you videotape this examination, either of your contacts?
No.
Have you ever videotaped an examination in the 30-some-odd years that you practiced psychiatry?
Not at my own request. I believe I've had several examinations videotaped by others.
Do you know whether Dr. Metzner, who's been a psychiatrist for some 30-odd years, video recorded his examination?
It was my understanding he did not.
Does that mean there's anything deficient or inappropriate or unreliable about his examination?
No, video recording is not a recognized standard.
Are you aware of whether Dr. Gurr videotaped her examination?
No.
Does that mean that her reports or opinions are somehow suspect for that very reason?
No, again, it's not a standard.
Did Dr. Hanlon videotape his examination?
No.
Did Dr. Gray videotape his examination?
No.
Did Dr. Manguso videotape her examination?
No.
Does the failure to videotape an examination have any meaning in terms of the conclusions or results that you draw from that examination?
Not in my opinion.
Is there a danger, perhaps, in placing too much emphasis on small details asked in the course of a video examination that took place some 3 years after the crime, when the defendant has been medicated for over 18 months by antipsychotic medications?
I think all the information in any interview, any examination, whether it be recorded audio, recorded video, or in observation by the examiner, has to be put in context. It has to be understood in context of all the information. And that's what the examination, the professional examination, is really all about. To take that information and say, this is a relevant piece of information, this is an irrelevant piece of information. And I think that that's why the information that comes through, that's produced in the examination, has to be, first of all, filtered and assessed through professional eyes.
So is the purpose of having a psychiatrist who's worked for 30 years studying psychotic patients in conducting an examination to interpret the statements that are made and to attribute which ones have psychiatric significance and which ones are maybe completely irrelevant? Or would it be more appropriate to just give all the statements to members of the jury who don't have that kind of psychiatric experience? Which would be a more reliable examination?
I am a strong proponent for the former. I think that this information has to be filtered by a professional. It's easy to misinterpret. It's easy enough for professionals to misinterpret it, but the point is that they have training and experience.
You were asked about hallucinations and whether Mr. Holmes said that he saw shadows or not. On the 24th of July, did Mr. Holmes tell you, in answer to your question about hallucinations, that he saw movement without explanation? Visual movement without cause.
Yes, he responded that he saw visual movement without cause and that as an undergraduate he had seen flashes to the side.
Did he report to you when you interviewed him on the 1st of April 2015 that he also had experienced shadows since that time?
Yes, he referred to those in the April 1st interview.
You were asked if on the 24th of July you asked him about trichotillomania. Now, when you went into that interview, did you have any information about what Mr. Holmes' symptoms were or whether he had suffered from trichotillomania or not?
No.
Is it contained in the record? Did he tell every examiner upon questioning that he had pulled his hair out since he was in middle school or high school as a result of his anxiety?
No.
Is there evidence in the record that he did tell some of them that?
Yes, and he did tell me that in the April 1st, 2015 interview.
Now, you were asked about him leaving school, and there was much attributed, and strike that. There were questions about whether he did that as a choice that he made. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Do you think that when he made that choice, if we're to call it a choice, that choice was colored and affected by the psychosis that he was suffering at the time?
I think that that was one of the main determinants, yes.
Is there any way to divorce a psychotic person's choices from the underlying delusional psychosis?
No, there is not.
Did he tell you on the 24th, when about that choice, that he felt as though he was asked to leave, and that's one of the reasons he left.
Yes.
Is there any evidence that you're aware of that he was asked to leave?
No, there was evidence that he was not asked to leave. He was encouraged to stay.
So let me ask you about, there's a number of statements in here that Mr. Brockler brought up with you which appear to be contradictory or don't appear to make sense. What can we attribute that to, Doctor?
Two things, really. One is the delusional psychosis, that system that was pushing him in different directions, and what we call ambivalence, that he feels more than one way and recalls more than one way about the same thing at the same time. And this is a good example of that. His choice for more than a decade had been to pursue what he called Plan A, which was neuroscience. That was his choice. That was what he was really committed to. And it was only after he felt failure in that he chose to leave, even though the evidence states that the school was trying to encourage him to stay.
You were asked if he told you about his grades and that he got good grades and whether he seemed proud of that or whether he should have been proud of that, I guess. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Is there any reason to think that Mr. Holmes was not being truthful about his grades, or what's the significant about him being proud of his grades?
Well, he expressed the grades to me. He told me what they were in his usual rather flat, emotional way. I certainly didn't get the sense that he was bragging so much as just giving me information. I'm a smart guy. And that was, I think, in support of and consistent with his pursuit of neuroscience and cure.
And was that consistent with the results of the neuropsychological testing, intelligence testing specifically, that was done by the neuropsychologist, Dr. Manguso, for the court, and Dr. Hanlon, who was retained by the defense?
Yes, they found overall high intelligence, certainly consistent with what you would expect with his background, but some specific areas of relative deficit that were thought to be associated with his illness.
Now, you were asked, and I believe you said you didn't recall ever receiving or reviewing Dr. Hanlon's report of the second time he went back a year later or so later in 2014 and did follow-up neuropsychological testing with Mr. Holmes. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Would it refresh your memory if I were to point out to you that, do you recall that as a result of that testing we found out that Mr. Holmes's nonverbal IQ decreased from a 127 to a 113 in the 1 year period between the 2013 testing and the 2014 testing?
Yes, I do recall that. It wasn't cited in my report, but I was reminded of that, and we had reviewed that.
Now, as a neurologist, sir, is that consistent with schizophrenia, with schizoaffective disorder?
Yes, it would be consistent. It's not diagnostic, but it would be consistent with this course.
Do people who have schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorders intelligence decline because essentially their brain shrinks over time?
Yes, that's true. The 19th century term for schizophrenia was dementia praecox, which means dementia of the young.
Do you recall in Dr. Hanlon's report that he notes that there's no other explanation for this dramatic decrease in Mr. Holmes's IQ?
Yes.
You were asked questions about whether Gargi, his girlfriend, suggested that he go in for treatment. Do you remember those line of questioning?
Yes.
And whether you asked him about that?
Yes.
Do you recall or not that by the time Gargi mentioned anything about getting some treatment to Mr. Holmes, that he was already voluntarily in psychiatric treatment, or do you not recall that?
I don't recall the exact sequence of their conversation and his getting into treatment, but certainly he did make the voluntary choice to seek treatment.
Now, you were asked some questions about Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. And the statement that was elicited was, what future would I have if I didn't have Plan C? Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Do you remember you saying to Mr. Brockler, that didn't make sense?
Yes.
You were asked about, when you asked Mr. Holmes about his philosophical view, and he made the statement, I hate everyone. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Did that make sense to you?
No.
Are there a number of statements that Mr. Holmes makes that don't make sense?
They don't make sense in the usual way. When one understands his psychopathology, I think, and the delusional structure that he has suffered with, they can at least be put in context. Delusional structures are not rational, so it doesn't amount to rationality, but at least it fits together in a delusional system at times. Sometimes it doesn't. The delusional system itself isn't always very coherent.
You were asked questions about whether Mr. Holmes ever used the phrase human capital with you. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And you said he did not, right?
that's correct.
Are you aware that he used the phrase human capital in the notebook that he sent before the shooting?
I believe I recall that.
Do you recall that on the 24th of July, when you questioned him about his delusions, that he indicated about the folks in the theater that he, quote, turned them into numbers?
Yes.
Does that sound similar
Yes,
to the
it
human
does.
capital concept that he describes to other psychiatrists and in the notebook?
Yes, and that had occurred to me when I learned about the human capital delusion, that these were both sort of numerical or economic
Now, the fact...
constructs.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. The fact that he didn't bring that up in the first interview, or that there might have been inconsistent statements over 3 years to different doctors about different things, is that expected when you're asking someone, what were you thinking 2 years ago when you were psychotic, or even 4 days ago when you were psychotic?
It is in my experience, absolutely. Inconsistency is
Now, you were asked about Mr. Holmes being catatonic, himself being catatonic, meaning that he was very, very sleepy and didn't feel like he could get up, and he tried to fit this in over lunch. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And there was kind of a joke made about fitting in your catatonia over lunch. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Is Mr. Holmes a psychiatrist who's accurately diagnosing himself with catatonia?
No, he is not, and he used the term incorrectly. I didn't have any indication on the basis of his reports that this was what a psychiatrist would call, and certainly all of the information, that information fit from a clinical perspective.
That you thought he was depressed as a result?
Yes, I think it did support that during that period of time when he had to change his schedule during the day and get rest during the day, that he had been more depressed during that phase.
You were asked about suicide and whether he'd mentioned to anyone that he was suicidal. He's certainly done so to the examiners that have talked to him since the shooting, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall when he spoke with Dr. Reed, he indicated to Dr. Reed that he was in fact suicidal in the spring of 2012 and that he actually had contemplated taking all of the sertraline at one time in order to commit suicide?
Yes.
You were asked about him going to class and going to 24-hour fitness and biking to school. Do you remember those questions?
Yes.
And you remember they were followed up with a question about how there was really no change in his day-to-day activities between January and June of 2012. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you recall in the record that between January and June of 2012, Mr. Holmes broke up with his girlfriend, the first girlfriend he's ever had?
Yes.
Was that something different for him?
Yes, and he experienced it as stressful.
Do you recall that Mr. Holmes cut off all contact with his friends and even deleted their phone numbers from his phone?
Sustained.
Do you recall whether or not Mr. Holmes cut off all contact with his friends or not?
Yes.
Do you recall whether or not Mr. Holmes described himself as going on spending sprees that was unusual for him?
Yes.
Do you recall him saying that he felt like things were in hyper speed?
Yes.
Do you recall him saying that he was driving at excessive rates of speed, which was not normal for him?
Yes.
Do you recall that he failed his preliminary examinations?
Yes.
Had he ever failed any schoolwork examinations before?
No.
Do you recall that he lost interest in the studies that he'd pursued his entire life?
Yes.
Is that different for him?
Yes.
Do you recall that he began buying weapons and armor and ammunition, despite the fact that he'd never desired or wanted or owned any of those things before?
Yes.
Do you recall that when he went and saw Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein, that they felt that he was experiencing a psychotic level of thinking?
Yes.
Do you recall that he then went into a movie theater and killed people because he thought it would increase his value?
Yes.
You were asked about your notations in there about sociopathy, and you were asked some questions about antisocial personality disorder. Did you write those in there because you thought Mr. Holmes had antisocial personality or was a sociopath?
No.
Did you write them in there because in any examination you have to take those things into consideration and rule them out?
Yes.
You were asked about some of the things that you relied upon in your report, and did you list every single specific item in your report that you reviewed?
No, I did not.
How long would your report have had to be in order to do that?
I don't know. Dozens of pages.
Did you attempt to put down a fairly comprehensive list of the nature of the things that you reviewed?
Yes, and I did omit the law enforcement records and the electronic communications.
And it appears after reviewing the email that you did actually review that. Is that right?
The one Mr. Brockler showed me I had seen, yes.
Now, is it very, very difficult as you sit here today, when asked about one specific piece of information, to recall in the vast amount of information you've reviewed, whether or not you reviewed that specific piece of information or who that came from or what report it came from?
I can't do that.
Does that mean that your conclusions or your practices are invalid or not, or substandard somehow?
I don't believe so.
You were asked questions about the social history, and did that come from the public defender, right?
Yes.
Do you recall that social history is supported by medical records and other documentation?
Yes, I've seen it in other documentation.
So when you're asked about, Mr. Holmes not listing in there where the information came from, that Mr. Holmes's aunt suffers from schizoaffective disorder for the past 35 years, is there any significance to the fact that you didn't list where that came from?
No, I don't believe so.
Does that mean it's not true? Does that mean that Mr. Holmes' aunt doesn't suffer from schizoaffective disorder?
I didn't confirm it with her medical records or by talking to anybody else in the family. That's generally the way we collect family history information clinically, so it's consistent with how we generally gather this sort of information. Sometimes it's not nearly that specific, but when somebody comes up with a diagnosis, for instance, of schizoaffective disorder, that usually would lend support to the fact that that diagnosis has been made medically, as opposed to a more generic kind of description of having a batty aunt or something like that.
You were asked some questions about whether you were familiar with Dr. Gray's second set of testing. Does it refresh your recollection that Dr. Gray did a second set of testing that accompanied Dr. Reed's examination and was contained in his report?
Yes.
Do you recall, now that I mentioned that his testing the second time around was entirely consistent with the testing the first time around?
Yes.
Does that change your opinions in any way?
No, that was part of the information I had reviewed in preparation for my report.
You were asked about if someone were to watch 23 hours of videotape from Dr. Reed, whether or not that would be the best, the longest, greatest period of time to observe Mr. Holmes. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Overruled?
Yes.
The fact that it's a long period of time, does that mean that it's automatically more significant?
No, I didn't think it was significant enough to alter my conclusions because I didn't have time to look at it. I felt that the information that I had reviewed from Dr. Reed's from the transcript and from the parts of the video I watched indicated that there was certainly some suggestion going on, and that that might have some influence. But even if that had not been going on, I would not have spent that amount of time. I don't think there was anything there as indicated by Dr. Reed's report which would have changed any of the conclusions I reached. After all, Dr. Reed did incorporate, he was there, and he incorporated all of that, the meaning of that information from his perspective into his report.
So do you think Dr. Reed took the 23 hours of examination and culled from it the parts that were significant and included those in the report and left out the parts that were not significant?
I assume that that's what he did. I think any examiner would do that. You're not going to include in your report the 300-page transcription.
And is it true that in your examination you may explore areas that turn out to not be significant?
Yes.
Now, you were asked about Mr. Holmes' writings, and you described in your report them both being philosophical ramblings. Is that fair?
Yes.
What did you mean by ramblings?
I meant that some of them had sort of a philosophical flavor to them, but they didn't make sense. They weren't well constructed. They weren't even the kind of things that I would expect from a sophomore. They weren't even that well organized. And I thought that they reflected a lot of cognitive and emotional disorganization.
And let's talk a little bit about that, because do you think those writings reflect the intellectual abilities of somebody who is a neuroscience student in graduate school, or did they seem a little sophomoric and childish?
Well, they were worse than that. They were, I characterized them as ramblings. They certainly did not represent what I knew to be his baseline cognitive abilities.
Did they reflect delusions?
They represented disorganizations. I think that there may have been allusions to delusions in them, but they were pretty disorganized.
Did, when you talk about them being philosophical, is there anything, if it's philosophical, does that mean that the person can't be psychotic? Or do quite often people who are psychotic adopt philosophical concepts and incorporate them in their delusional system?
They often do that, and it seems to be a way that the emotional content for the person gets attached to ideas. So ideas take on more emotional content than they would for someone else. And they may use philosophical references at the same time.
You were confronted about your opinion that Mr. Holmes was delusional, and it was pointed out in that stack of emails and other documents before you that there was no delusional content in those emails, and that there was no delusional reporting to Mr. Holmes's professors and to law enforcement. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
The fact that there's no delusional content in the emails or to the professors or law enforcement, does that mean that he wasn't delusional?
It doesn't mean that, and considering what he has said about his delusions, one of his delusions was that if he revealed things, if he talked about them, then his delusions would take on even more force or he couldn't resist them. And it appears that for a long, long time, he really was very, very careful about that, not to let people know what he was thinking, not to let people know what his thoughts were in regard to suicide and homicide, because of this sense that if he said something, then he would have to act on it.
Now,
So it was part of the way that he was trying to contain this and protect himself.
Now, we know that those may not reflect delusions, or that his professors may not have identified delusions. But has every psychiatrist who's examined Mr. Holmes indicated that their opinion is that he suffered from delusions?
Yes, and the main reason for that is that in these interviews, he has admitted that. All of these have occurred after this crime, and after a part of the delusional system was, the delusional mission was completed, and after he had the delusional sense that he had increased his self-worth, that was when he was willing to tell people this. Before that, he was at best very, for instance, with Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein, he revealed enough to make it clear to them that he was ill and at risk for violence, but not revealed the specifics about that.
Judge, I apologize. I said I was going to be 20 minutes, and I think I'm going to be more like another 5 minutes, which probably means another 10 minutes. So,
All right, we'll take our lunch. All right, folks, please keep in mind my admonitions during the lunch break. They all apply. I'll see you back here at about a little bit after 2 o'clock, okay? We'll take the usual hour and a half. Thank you. All right, the records reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. I'll see you after lunch. The court will be in recess. Thank you.
Please rise.